Attention! Attention! Ladies and gentlemen, attention! There is a herd of killer rabbits headed this way and we desperately need your help. Roll up your windows. Turn on your lights and follow the police car at the entrance of the theater. Please keep calm and cooperate with the authorities.
Welcome to the very first episode of the Horror Double Bill. I'm Craig Johnson, and each week I'm going to be pairing two films that share something more than just a few similarities. They're connected in ways that will make you see them in a whole new light. This podcast isn't just about a couple of scary movies. It's about how themes, tones, and a bit of cinematic magic can combine to create something far greater than the sum of its parts. For me, horror isn't just a genre. It's a feeling, a sense of creeping unease that seeps into thrillers, dark comedies, psychological dramas, and even sci-fi. Each episode, I'm going to try to discuss the films in a way that avoids too many spoilers, so I'll be exploring their themes, backgrounds, influences, and the social and historical context in which they were made. Then, if I do need to discuss spoilers, I'm going to clearly signpost them. And after that, anything and everything will be up for discussion. So whether you're discovering these films for the very first time, or revisiting them with fresh eyes, there should be something here for you. For this inaugural episode, I'm going Spanish and exploring paranoia and claustrophobia with a fair amount of dark humour. First up is La Cabina from 1972, a short film that will have you reconsidering the next time you think about entering a small enclosed space. Then I'll be moving on to El Bar from 2017, which places a group of unsuspecting strangers in a claustrophobic Madrid bar and lets paranoia build to breaking point. Along the way, I'll be discussing the golden age of Spanish horror, the effects of censorship, fascism and terrorism on Spanish cinema, and why, if you're a Spanish man, you'd never let yourself become a werewolf. And trust me, there is a lot more to that than you might think. Both of this week's films explore the feeling of being trapped in more ways than one, whether it's physically or mentally, and both share a very twisted sense of humour. But before we dive into this week's films, I want to mention some of the key references that have helped shape this episode. My main sources for this week's discussion include the books The Spanish Fantastic, Contemporary Filmmaking in Horror, Fantasy and Sci-Fi by Sheila Rowan Legg, the Spanish horror film by Antonio Mercero, and Sex, Sadism, Spain and Cinema by Nicholas G. Schlegel. When discussing La Cabina, I'm also going to be drawing heavily from a brilliant article titled La Cabina, Creating Horror from the Absurd, and that's by a writer called Amius, which was published on theartifice.com. I'm going to also link that article in the show notes. And for El Bar, I'll be referencing interviews and articles from Anthem magazine by Ki Chang in July 2017, Variety magazine by Martin Dale in 2014, and insights from the 2017 press conference and an interview on cineeuropa.org. While I'm here, I should also probably issue a preemptive apology for my pronunciation of Spanish names. I've genuinely spent hours on howtopronounce.com, listening, repeating, and doing my very best, but I'm going to be honest, I know I'm going to get some of them very, very wrong. So, to any Spanish speakers out there, I do apologise in advance. Please know that any butchering of vowels or misplaced emphasis is done with the utmost respect and absolutely no linguistic competence at all on my part. I first saw La Cabina when I was 11 years old, thanks to the now legendary BBC Two horror double bills, the same ones that inspired this podcast. If you grew up in Britain in the 1970s or early 1980s, your first proper introduction to horror probably didn't come from a trip to the cinema or even a VHS tape. It came from BBC Two. These double bills were a late-night ritual for anyone willing to defy bedtime, offering a carefully curated pairing of horror films. In the days before VCRs became a household staple, if you wanted to see horror, you pretty much had to be there. No pause button, no rewinding, just you, the glow of the television, and the creeping dread of whatever the night selection had in store. For many people, including myself, this was our gateway to horror. Each week I would race to grab our TV listings guide, the Radio Times, and then I'd scan the listings and circle that week's movies with a felt tip pen. When the films finally aired, the next day was spent dissecting them with friends, and for me, often ironically, this was at choir practice. Because yes, I was a choir boy, and no, I wasn't particularly angelic. It was through these double bills that I saw my first ever horror movie when I was 7 years old, and that was Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. Arguably, perhaps that was far too young, but then again, what's childhood for if not being slightly traumatised by Lon Chaney Jr. stalking a policeman through the streets of Cardiff? But this was a one-off exception. It wasn't until I turned 10 that I was finally allowed to stay up for the full double bill, joining my brother in watching both films in their entirety. This, for me, was a real rite of passage. Staying awake through the second feature, eyes straining to keep from closing, willing myself to take in every shadowy figure and flickering terror on the screen. It was through these double bills that I saw my first ever George Romero film, which wasn't Night of the Living Dead, it was The Crazies. And that's a film that left a mark on me in ways I really wasn't prepared for, and we'll be discussing that in a couple of weeks' time. It was also where I discovered the shadowy genius of Val Lewton, who we'll be discussing next week, and it also gave me my very first encounter with one of my horror heroes, Boris Karloff, whose presence alone can elevate pretty much any film he's in. The double bills often paired classic Universal monster movies with grittier, more modern horror, bridging the gap between the gothic past and the psychological and visceral terrors of the present. They didn't just introduce me to vampires, werewolves and the undead, they taught me the language of horror itself. The horror double bills were communal experiences, shared across living rooms up and down the country and facilitating excited discussions the following day. And that's what I'm really hoping this podcast will also achieve. Beyond the classics, Universal monsters and Hammer horrors, these double bills had a gloriously unhinged side. Between genuinely great films, these schedulers would also slip in something like Zoltan, Hound of Dracula, which asks the vital question, what if Dracula had a vampire dog? Or Night of the Lepus, in which Janet Leigh and Stuart Whitman are pursued across the American countryside by giant bloodthirsty rabbits. At the time, I had no idea whether I was going to watch a masterpiece or a B-movie fever dream, but that was part of the joy. Horror in all its forms, trashy, terrifying, or just deeply weird, was given a place at the table. And every week I would race back to the Radio Times to see what fresh nightmares awaited, ready to discuss them with my friends at choir practice the next day. Because nothing, says Angelic Choir Boy, like an in-depth debate on whether Race with the Devil is better than The Beast Must Die. It is, by the way. Except on one summer Saturday in 1981, it wasn't a double bill that was shown, it was a triple bill. The Spanish short film La Cabina was sandwiched between the televised cricket, Isle of the Dead and The Crazies, which looking back is a pretty surreal combination. And yet it's La Cabina that left the deepest mark. Everyone who saw it that night still talks about it, and even now decades later you'll see people asking about it on social media. What's that weird Spanish movie with the telephone box? Because once you've seen it, you really don't forget it. The Radio Times listing that week had described it, rather cryptically, as a man trapped in a telephone box enters a nightmare, which to my 11-year-old brain sounded like it might be a horror version of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. It isn't, but that's a film I would still pay good money to see, by the way, so if anyone knows of one, please do let me know. Before I dive into La Cabina itself though, I think it's important to take a step back and talk about the context in which it was made, which means the Spanish Civil War and the Franco dictatorship. Because without that context, you don't really fully grasp the world that shaped the film. La Cabina isn't just a surreal, nightmarish short film. It's a reflection of a country that had spent decades under an oppressive regime, where censorship, control and fear dictated everyday life. Even though Franco's grip was loosening by the early 1970s, the scars of his rule were everywhere, and you can feel that tension running beneath La Cabina's seemingly simple premise. This isn't just about a man trapped in a telephone box. It's about power, submission, and the terrifying realization that no one is coming to save you. So, before we get into the film itself, we need to talk about the history that made it possible, and why even today, it still carries the weight of Spain's troubled past. Spain in the 1930s was a country on the brink, socially, politically, and economically. Decades of instability, class conflict, and failed attempts at reform had left very deep divisions. On one side, you had the Republicans, a coalition of leftists, socialists, communists, anarchists, and pretty much anyone who wanted to modernise Spain and strip power from the monarchy, the church, and the landed elite. On the other side, you had the nationalists, conservative, Catholic, authoritarian, and crucially and terrifyingly, backed by a rising force in Europe: fascism. In July 1936, a right-wing military coup attempted to overthrow the democratically elected Republican government. It didn't go as planned. Instead of a swift takeover, Spain erupted into a full-blown civil war. What followed was one of the most brutal and ideologically charged conflicts of the 20th century. A proxy war where Hitler and Mussolini sent planes, troops and weapons to the nationalists, while the Soviet Union and international volunteers fought for the Republicans. The war was savage. Cities were bombed into rubble, villages were massacred, and political enemies were executed by the thousands. And then there was Guernica, an entire town obliterated by German bombers in an early experiment in total warfare. Picasso captured its horror in his famous painting, but for those who lived through it, no artwork could match the reality. Francisco Franco became the leader of the nationalists, and there is a phrase attributed to him during the war: centimetro a centimetro, or centimetre by centimetre. This phrase encapsulates his grimly deliberate approach during the conflict. Rather than seeking a swift, sweeping victory, Franco pursued a slow, grinding war of attrition. This strategy allowed him to consolidate control over captured areas, root out oppression, and terrorize the civilian population into submission. It wasn't just a military tactic. This was psychological warfare. By advancing incrementally, Franco could ensure that repression was deeply felt in every village and every town. His forces, often aided by the German Condor Legion and Italian troops, targeted not only Republican soldiers, but also intellectuals, teachers, and unionists. In fact, anyone suspected of opposing nationalist ideology. The phrase has since become symbolic of the ruthlessness and calculated cruelty of his campaign, and of the broader fascist belief in total ideological domination, centimetre by centimetre, brick by brick, and life by life. After 3 years of bloodshed, Franco's nationalists emerged victorious in 1939. But what followed wasn't peace, it was a reign of terror. Tens of thousands of people were executed, imprisoned, or disappeared, as Franco set about reshaping Spain into a fascist dictatorship that would last for nearly 4 decades. The Spanish Civil War wasn't just a conflict between two sides. It was a clash of ideology: democracy versus dictatorship, progress versus reaction, and freedom versus control. And while Spain has since reckoned with its past, the scars of that war still linger in its politics, its culture, and its cinema. After the war, Spain didn't just pick itself up and carry on. It staggered into what became known as the Years of Hunger from 1939 to 1952. The country was on its knees. Food was scarce, people were starving, and daily life was brutal. If you asked Franco's regime, they would blame everybody except themselves. It was the bad weather. It was international isolation. It was even the war itself. But the famine and economic collapse weren't just bad luck. They were the direct result of Franco's policies. Instead of rebuilding the country with effective economic strategy, the dictatorship went all in on a self-sufficiency model which was known as autarky. It was a disaster. The government wanted total control over production and trade, aiming to turn Spain into a powerful industrialized empire. But what actually happened was famine, the rise of the black market, and suffering on an enormous scale. And yet Franco's government flat out denied that there was any famine at all. They used censorship to bury the truth, suppressing reports of starvation, disease, and abandoned children, while broadcasting that other countries were struggling as well. Meanwhile, political repression continued in full force. By 1941, Spanish prisons were overflowing, packed with around 233,000 political prisoners. Estimates vary, but at least 35,000 people were executed. If you wanted to control Spain, you had to control what people saw, heard, and thought. Franco understood this perfectly. His regime ran one of the most extensive and repressive censorship operations in 20th century Europe. Everything was monitored. Newspapers, books, music, theatre, and crucially for us, cinema. Film had the power to influence the masses, and that made it dangerous. So, Franco's censors, which included members of the Catholic Church, ensured that only acceptable content made it to Spanish screens. And what did acceptable mean? Well, anything that glorified Catholicism, Spanish nationalism, and traditional family values. Anything that suggested rebellion, independent thought, or a whiff of moral ambiguity, well, that was gone. Foreign films certainly didn't get a free pass. They were either banned outright or aggressively edited to align with Francoist ideology. Dialogue was rewritten, entire scenes cut, and in some cases completely new endings were filmed, all to conform to the regime's strict moral code. The most famous example is a film called Mogambo from 1953, where Grace Kelly's character was originally having an affair with a married man. Well, that of course wouldn't do. So, in the Spanish dubbed version, the script was altered to make them siblings, creating an entirely unintended incestuous subtext. Nice move, Mr. Censor, well done. And homegrown cinema was also heavily policed. Spanish filmmakers had to submit scripts for approval before production, and once the film was complete, it could still be blocked or significantly altered. Directors had to become experts in subtext and metaphor, hiding political messages beneath layers of symbolism. This led to a unique style of Spanish cinema, where what wasn't said was often more important than what was. Horror, as a homegrown genre, was banned outright, as it was seen as highly subversive. So what changed? By the late 1940s, Franco's dream of a self-sufficient Spain had clearly flopped. The economy was in tatters, but more importantly, the global political landscape was changing. The US was ramping up its Cold War stance, and suddenly Franco, once the isolated dictator, became useful. To President Eisenhower, Spain suddenly wasn't just some struggling backwater, it was a potential strategic ally. Franco was fiercely anti-communist, and that made him valuable. In 1947, the US military decided it was time to rethink their stance on Spain, and by 1953, the Pact of Madrid was signed. This was a huge deal. Spain got economic and military aid, and in return, the US got 3 shiny new air bases and a naval base in which to house nuclear weapons. Spain, once frozen out of international trade, was suddenly back in business. With the economy opening up, Franco needed a cultural makeover. Enter Operation Exterior Propaganda, a push to boost tourism, encourage consumerism, and import foreign culture, but all, of course, on Franco's terms. At the same time, a new breed of politicians known as the technocrats, many of them members of the Catholic group Opus Dei, started enacting economic reforms. This kicked off what became known as Spain's economic miracle, a period from 1959 to 1974, where the GDP shot up by an average of 6.5% a year. And along with tourism came another golden opportunity: cinema. Franco had always known that film was a powerful tool, and now it became not just entertainment or propaganda, but a way to showcase Spain to the world. Hollywood took notice, and soon Spain became a go-to location for cheap, large-scale productions. Madrid essentially became Hollywood in Spain, with US studios flocking to film there. In 1961, two major historical epics set up shop: Nicholas Ray's King of Kings and Anthony Mann's El Cid, starring Charlton Heston and Sophia Loren. But this wasn't just about Hollywood. The floodgates opened up for international co-productions, including what would become a legendary genre, the spaghetti western. Italian director Sergio Leone famously shot his Dollars trilogy in Spain, turning the deserts of Almeria into the Wild West. And here's where things get really interesting. Tourism didn't just bring in money, it brought in culture. Millions of visitors from countries with far more relaxed attitudes towards sex and violence in media flooded into Spain. And no matter how much Franco tried to control things, change was inevitable. By the early 1960s, other European countries, Italy, Germany, France, and the UK, were fully embracing modern horror, and they saw Spain as a lucrative filming partner. This brings us to 1962, when Spain produced its first modern horror film, a co-production with France, directed by Jesus Franco, no relation. This was the moment when Spanish horror truly began to take shape, setting the stage for what was to come. The film was Gritos en la Noche, or Cries in the Night, better known internationally as The Awful Dr. Orloff. Released in 1962, it laid the foundation for many of the tropes that would define Spanish horror over the next decade. But getting it past the censors, well, that required quite a bit of creative manoeuvring. Spain under Franco was hardly an ideal place to make horror films, or at least not ones set in Spain. The regime's strict censorship meant that anything remotely unwholesome, unpatriotic, or subversive was heavily scrutinised. To get around this, filmmakers often relocated their stories to some vague, ambiguously European setting where the horrors of the past, or present, could unfold without drawing too much attention. The key was to ensure that Spain itself remained unsullied by anything too monstrous. One of the best-known examples of this absurdity is the possibly apocryphal story about Jacinto Molina, better known as Paul Naschy, the godfather of Spanish horror. When he pitched his first film, The Mark of the Werewolf, he was allegedly told that his protagonist couldn't be Spanish because, of course, no self-respecting Spaniard would ever allow himself to become a werewolf. True or not, and part of me really hopes it is true, the anecdote captures the ridiculous contradictions of the time. Supernatural horror is permissible, but only if it happens somewhere else. This is partly why so much Spanish horror of the era feels strangely disconnected from its own country, borrowing settings and iconography from Germany, France, or Eastern Europe. It was far easier for the censor to pretend that horror was something that happened somewhere else, rather than acknowledge that Spain had its own darkness. Meanwhile, directors who dared to set their films in contemporary Spain, like Eloy de la Iglesia, were relentlessly targeted. The censors demanded endless cuts and tried to strip the films of anything that might have real bite. Sometimes they succeeded, and other times things managed to slip under the wire. And yet, even if Spanish horror often had to wear a foreign mask, its themes remained deeply tied to Spain's own anxieties: repression, violence, and the ghosts of the past. No matter how far the censor tried to hide it, the fear was always homegrown. Even with its overseas setting, Dr. Orloff was heavily censored, while a more violent, uncut version was distributed internationally. And though Dr. Orloff borrows heavily from George Franju's Eyes Without a Face, what sets it apart isn't just its sadistic streak, allowed in part because it was a co-production with France. It's also its surprisingly progressive female lead. Although the film could hardly be described as feminist, in a dictatorship dominated by Catholic conservatism, a movie with a strong independent heroine who outshines the so-called hero was practically revolutionary. And people act like woke filmmaking is a modern invention. Better not let Ben Shapiro know. Despite these censorship battles, Dr. Orloff was a financial success. It spawned sequels, launched Jesus Franco's long and notorious career, and firmly planted horror into the Spanish cinematic landscape. More importantly, it revealed something crucial about Spanish horror. In a country where open political expression was dangerous, where people had witnessed real-life horror inflicted by their own government, and where women's independence was systematically crushed, horror became an outlet, a pressure valve, and a subversive way to speak out. Maybe the censors had been right to be worried. While Dr. Orloff is often credited as Spain's first horror film, the golden age of Spanish horror didn't really begin until 1968, when actor, writer and director Jacinto Molina Alvarez managed to secure funding for his werewolf film Mark of the Wolfman. Originally, the legendary Lon Chaney Jr. was supposed to star, but when he was too ill to travel, Molina stepped in. The German co-producers, thinking that his Spanish name wouldn't sell abroad, insisted that he change it. And just like that, Paul Naschy was born. Naschy quickly became an icon, Spain's answer to Christopher Lee or Vincent Price. And if Dr. Orloff had opened the door, Naschy's werewolf smashed it down. Once again though, the film had to take place outside Spain. His character was named Valdemar Daninsky, which is about as un-Spanish as you can get, all to keep the censor at bay. But the film was a huge hit. It's widely seen as the movie that truly kicked off the golden age of Spanish horror, or more properly, the era of Fanterror, which is a mashup of fantastico, meaning fantasy, and of course the word terror. From 1968 to 1976, Fanterror dominated Spain's film industry, accounting for nearly a third of all productions, and this didn't go unnoticed. One critic ranted that filmmakers had unleashed a, wait for it, quote, whole vile rabble of sadists, traumatized victims, prostitutes, homosexuals, lesbians, werewolves, vampires, tramps, schizophrenics, fetishists, nymphomaniacs, necrophiles, and people of dissolute life, in a maelstrom of crime, orgy, and erotic morbidness. End quote. And that's with censorship. See, this is what happens when you try to repress things. If the wife of the vicar has never touched liquor, watch out when she finds the champagne. Meanwhile, horror wasn't just confined to cinemas. Spanish television also found its own way to scare audiences. In 1966, TVE1, the state-run national channel, launched the series Tales to Keep You Awake, which is often referred to as Spain's answer to The Twilight Zone. Created by the director Narciso Ibáñez Serrador, it adapted works by Edgar Allan Poe, Ray Bradbury, and many others. With only one TV channel at the time, until TVE2 launched later the same year, it had a captive audience, and it worked. The episode titled El Asfalto, or The Asphalt, even won the Golden Nymph for Best Script at the Monte Carlo Television Festival, winning Spain's first international TV award. Serrador would go on to direct the film La Residencia, also known as The House That Screamed, in 1969, a film that is a thinly veiled critique of Francoist oppression. And in 1976, he gave us Who Can Kill a Child, a film we'll be talking about in a few weeks' time. Horror wasn't just a fad in Spain. It had embedded itself into the culture, in people's living rooms as well as the cinema. And with only 2 channels to choose from, let's be honest, everyone was watching. And when it was finally televised, everyone in Spain watched La Cabina. Now, before we go any further, if you haven't seen La Cabina yet, this is the perfect moment to pause the podcast and give it a watch. It's only 37 minutes long and is currently available on YouTube via the TVE Televisión Española channel. I'm also going to link it in the show notes. It's really a film that's best experienced with as little prior knowledge as possible, so I highly recommend you go in cold and then come back for the discussion. I promise you the film is more than worth it. La Cabina won its director Antonio Mercero the 1973 International Emmy Award for Best Fiction. It's inspired countless parodies and artworks, and even found its way into the series Black Mirror, with Charlie Brooker paying homage to it in the episode White Bear. And that's not bad for a 37-minute Spanish TV movie about a bloke getting stuck in a telephone box. Mercero, whose full name was Antonio Mercero Juldane, was born in 1936 and originally studied law before turning to filmmaking, presumably realising that cinema had more potential for existential horror than the Spanish legal system. He made his debut with a short film about a shepherd and quickly started racking up awards, including one for a children's short film. Like many directors, he worked his way up, doing everything from assistant directing to second unit work, and then he broke into television in 1968 with a documentary series titled Fiesta. But the idea for La Cabina had been rattling around his head for a number of years. In early 1972, after a routine Monday morning production meeting, Mercero went for lunch with his friends, the filmmaker José Luis García and screenwriter Horacio Valcarel. Over food, football and film chat, he mentioned a surreal comedy sketch that he'd abandoned back in 1970 about a man trapped inside a sealed telephone box. Allegedly inspired by a short story from Spanish journalist Juan José Plans Martinez, the idea was resurrected and added to an anthology project called 13 Steps to the Unusual. Unfortunately, when they pitched it to Televisión Española, the state-run national broadcaster, they were swiftly rejected. But Mercero wasn't one to take no for an answer. By this time, Franco's regime was softening its stance on cultural censorship and trying to present a more liberal modern image in a bid to join the European community. TVE was also eager to develop projects that could compete in international festivals. Sensing an opportunity, Mercero resubmitted the anthology, and to sweeten the deal, he reminded executives that he had previously made a series that was essentially state-sponsored Franco propaganda. The way that he saw it, TVE owed him a favour, and begrudgingly they agreed. Kind of. Instead of approving the whole anthology, they greenlit 2 scripts. One became The Mona Lisa Has Lost Her Smile in 1976, a darkly comic film in which the Mona Lisa does indeed lose her smile and the world spirals into chaos. The other was a surrealist telephone box sketch. The rest of the anthology, according to García, was put in a drawer and never heard of again. When it came to casting, the central role in La Cabina needed a performer who could switch effortlessly between comedy and tragedy. Mercero had very strong ideas about this. He essentially wanted to cast somebody who was an expert in mime. And he knew exactly who to cast, an actor called José Luis López Vázquez. Vázquez was already a very well-known stage and screen actor, but what caught Mercero's attention was his performance in a very controversial black comedy from 1972, in which he played a woman who discovers very late in life that she was actually born male and raised as a female. A very complex and nuanced role that had earned him much acclaim. Mercero was convinced this was the central character who would be stuck in the telephone box. And it turned out to be a stroke of genius. Vázquez's performance in La Cabina is nothing short of masterful, embodying the full horror of the human condition. Years later, he reflected on the film's deeper meaning, saying, quote, "The script seemed to me to be a very hard, very dramatic and tragic story. Above all else, it symbolised the human state, the end of life, the total annulment of the senses, disintegration. It caused me to feel restless." End quote. And that's exactly what La Cabina does to the audience. It leaves you unsettled, gnawing at your subconscious long after the credits roll. No wonder it became one of the most iconic and terrifying pieces of Spanish television ever made. With a budget of just 4 million pesetas, which is roughly $27,000 in today's money, La Cabina was hardly a lavish production. And even with an officially approved shooting script, Mercero still had to navigate government interference before filming could even begin. The Ministry of Information and Tourism, always keen to promote a modern and progressive image of Spain, insisted that he include shots of a revitalised Madrid, showing the country's economic growth. Mercero, of course, complied. Sort of. His version of a modernised Spain includes sterile concrete apartment blocks that look more like prison cells, half-finished high-rises, and shots of gentrified suburbia juxtaposed against junkyards and rural decay. Through Mercero's lens, Spain wasn't modernising, it was tearing itself into two. Filming kicked off on the 17th of July 1972, running through late August, and it was a brutal experience, especially for Jose Luis Lopez Vasquez. The initial 7-day shoot in the plaza was an endurance test. Trapped inside the phone box under the relentless Spanish sun, Vasquez struggled to breathe. The glass panes had already been swapped out for perspex, partly to avoid injury when a character tries to break the phone box open, but even then the heat was unbearable, and for close-ups the lower panes had to be removed just to give the actor some air to breathe. Okay, so now we are getting heavily into spoilers, and if you still haven't seen the film, just be warned, I'm about to give a lot away. The opening of La Cabina is deceptively light, it's almost comedic. There's something of Jacques Tati in the way that it unfolds. There's a skittish score, a bright primary coloured world, and the gentle absurdity of the situation. A man steps into a phone booth, the door closes, and what follows feels like an amusing little mishap. The way that people react, gathering, gesturing, and offering advice without much actual help, has the rhythm of a small-town farce. At first, it feels like a communal effort. A couple of passers-by try to pry the door open, a workman gives it a go, even a policeman gets involved. But soon the tone shifts. The longer the man becomes trapped, the more detached the crowd becomes. The urgency fades, replaced by a kind of passive fascination, and what starts as a rescue attempt soon turns into a spectacle. If this film was made today, half of the crowd would have their phones out filming, one man's misery becoming another man's viral content. Even in 1972, Mercero seems to be commenting on the erosion of empathy, the way that suffering, when framed just right, stops feeling real and starts becoming entertainment. The laughter of the crowd at the beginning of the film isn't cruel yet, but it's indifferent. And in that indifference, horror begins to take root. As La Cabina progresses, we move on an emotional journey as well as a physical one. What began as an absurd inconvenience soon starts to spiral into something far more sinister. The moment that our protagonist sees another man trapped in an identical phone box, the unease that has been gnawing at him turns into outright terror. Before he was bewildered, confused but still hopeful. Now that hope vanishes. His discomfort sharpens into desperation and then hardens into the realization that this is no accident. It's a nightmare that has only just begun. As a truck carries him through the city, small details take on a cruel significance. A child chases after the vehicle, offering a fleeting reminder of the protagonist's own fatherhood and of the life from which he is being wrenched away. A group of circus performers watch from over a wall, detached but observant. One of them is holding a ship in the bottle, in an unsettling mirror of the man in the box. But it is these outsiders, these figures of the grotesque, who seem to regard him with the most empathy. These so-called normal people, once gathered in the town square, have long since moved on. The spectacle is over for them, but for our central character, the horror is getting worse. The film's final third, the horrific transportation of the phone box, was assembled from locations across Spain and Portugal. Madrid's newly built cargo terminal at Barajas Airport provides a conveyor system seamlessly edited into the nightmarish climax, which I won't be discussing here. Ironically, La Cabina nearly never aired in Spain. After winning the International Critics Award at the 1972 Monte Carlo Festival of Television, TVE executives began second-guessing themselves. Was Mercero's little horror fantasy actually a critique of the Franco regime? Some at TVE suspected as much. To be safe, the transmission date was indefinitely postponed, while a ministerial decision was awaited. But with the Spanish press celebrating Mercero's Monte Carlo success and the promise of lucrative international sales, TVE executives caved in. Finally, on the 13th of December 1972 at 10 p.m, La Cabina aired on TVE's LA1 channel. Afterwards, viewers went to bed, still trying to make sense of what they'd watched. In the days that followed, the film became the talk of living rooms, offices and bars. Many were gripped by its mystery, others unsettled by its eerie ambiguity. The idea that it held some deeper hidden meaning only added to its allure. Before long, the film made its way across the Atlantic, where it found critical success in the US, eventually earning Mercero an Emmy Award. But there was one more unexpected hiccup. German composer Karl Orff, of Carmina Burana fame, sued Mercero for using a piece from one of his operettas without permission. Apparently Mercero had simply forgotten to ask. To avoid a scandal, Orff was invited to a private screening, and after watching the film, he was so impressed that he allowed the music to stay, settling the matter out of court. Perhaps he recognised that La Cabina was something very special, an unforgetting piece of Spanish horror, smuggled past the censors, drenched in paranoia, and with the power to haunt audiences decades later. For years, La Cabina has been dissected, debated, and reinterpreted. When it first aired, a French communist newspaper, Humanité, declared it as the gravest criticism of the Franco regime. Even now, IMDb comments are filled with viewers who see it as a blistering metaphor for Spanish authoritarianism. Others interpret the phone box as a system that forces everyone to conform, regardless of the cost. Theories have ranged from the plausible to the downright bizarre. Some viewers in the 1970s thought the film was about an alien invasion, and I have no idea at all where they got that idea from. Religious audiences have seen it as a metaphor for mankind's expulsion from Eden. More modern readings have focused on the loss of individual liberty in a world increasingly dominated by faceless corporations, represented by the ominous anonymous phone company. Antonio Mercero, for his part, always dismissed any direct link to Franco's Spain. When asked about it in an interview with the now defunct Terra Fantastic magazine, he insisted, quote, "Jose Luis Garcia and I recognise that when we wrote the script, we were closer to the world of science fiction and terror than any political theme. We also realised that our story had many readings, and that this was its richness and complexity. I would say then that La Cabina is a parable open to all kinds of interpretations, and according to the sensitivity, culture and formation of each person, it will be interpreted differently, and those multiple interpretations will always be valid." End quote. In other words, believe what you like. However, in a later interview in 2009, the same year that Jose Luis Lopez Vasquez passed away and Mercero was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, the director seemed to reveal his own personal take on the film. Quote, "All human beings have boxes that we need to get rid of. There are boxes of the moral type, there are boxes of the educational type, there are boxes of the mental type, economic boxes that imprison us. And I believe that life is a continuing quest for freedom from each one of these boxes. In order to be free, spontaneous and happy, each person has to see which box imprisons him and try to free himself. This is our destiny." End quote. That, according to Mercero, is what La Cabina was always about. Not just one metaphorical prison, but the many invisible prisons that we construct for ourselves. José Luis López Vázquez, the face of La Cabina, passed away in Madrid on November 2nd, 2009, after starring in over 200 films. 5 years earlier, he had received the honorary Goya Award for Lifetime Achievement, Spain's equivalent of an Oscar. Mercero's own final film in 2007 was a family drama about Alzheimer's, an all too poignant choice given that he himself would be diagnosed with the disease just 2 years later. In 2009, he too was awarded with an honorary Goya, a fitting tribute to a career that spanned half a century. He passed away at the age of 82 on May 12, 2018, at home surrounded by his family. And here I am going to quote directly from the article on The Artifice, which again is linked in the show notes. It's a beautifully written article and contains a beautifully written epitaph for a very talented filmmaker. Quote, "He had always wished to leave this world while watching his favourite American musical, Singing in the Rain. It would be nice to think that his wish was granted." End quote. We are now moving on to our second film in this week's double bill, and this is El Bar from 2017. El Bar is directed by Álex de la Iglesia and is written by Álex de la Iglesia and Jorge Gurrichaecheverria. It stars Bianca Suarez, Carmen Machi, Mario Casas and Terele Pavez. Álex de la Iglesia is a multi-award-winning film director, screenwriter, producer and former comic book artist. As of the time of recording, he has directed 19 films, spanning a range of styles from comedy to drama to documentary. Even his more genre-based films like Day of the Beast, Witching and Bitching, Perdita Durango and this week's film El Bar refuse to sit neatly in a single category. They gleefully mash up comedy, satire, horror and thriller elements, creating something completely unpredictable and entirely his own. Of his own work, De la Iglesia has said that trying to define his genre is nearly impossible, but if he had to, he would call it grotesque tragedy, something that captures the absurdity of life. He likes playing with ridiculous ideas, but has also been quoted as saying that defining the genre of his films would be like masturbating to naked pictures of himself, which, to be honest, tells you pretty much everything you need to know about his stance on genre theory. We're going to be talking about his films a lot in this series, so I think it's only right we start with a bit of background. Álex de la Iglesia was born in Bilbao in Spain in 1965. His father was a sociology professor and his mother was a painter. Although both parents come from what you might call liberal backgrounds, they weren't entirely thrilled about his career ambitions. He once recounted that when he told his parents he wanted to become a philosopher, they had a fit, and that when he wanted to become a filmmaker, they said he was even crazier, saying that it was like wanting to become an astronaut. As a child, he was exposed to a wide range of cultural influences, Japanese animation, Spanish cinema, and international movies. But he also grew up in the last decade of Franco's rule, which, as we've heard, was a period of intense political and social unrest. The Basque separatist group ETA was conducting a long-term campaign of terrorist attacks during his childhood, and he described life in Bilbao at the time as surreal, like living in a circus, where bombs were going off near his home and where violence was constant. He recalls that while no one wanted to talk about the violence, it felt very much that there were monsters everywhere. He was a huge fan of role-playing games and immersed himself in film, particularly those shown on Spanish television. I have no idea whether he saw La Cabina or not on its first airing, but I imagine he certainly encountered it at some point during his childhood. At 13, inspired partly by famous monsters of filmland, he began drawing comic books, photocopying them and handing them out to his friends at school. He studied philosophy at university, and though he has admitted he often fell asleep in class and that none of his friends were particularly satisfied with their education, he found an outlet in Bilbao's underground comic scene, drawing inspiration from Alex Raymond, the creator of Flash Gordon, and Stan Lee. Around this time, he also founded one of Spain's first role-playing clubs, Los Pelotas. A turning point came when a priest, of all people, suggested that he attend the San Sebastian Film Festival, where he met friends who were making horror movies, an encounter that sparked his serious interest in the genre. He started working in art design and set decoration for television and short films, before making his own short in 1991, Merindas Asesinas, which caught the attention of Pedro Almodóvar. At the time, Almodóvar's production company was branching out, backing films that pushed the boundaries of Spanish cinema. With their support, De la Iglesia directed his first feature, Acción Mutante, or Mutant Action, which is a gleefully chaotic mix of horror, sci-fi, western and heist movie. But it was his next film, El Día de la Bestia, or The Day of the Beast, in 1995, that catapulted him to widespread attention. Despite some lukewarm critical reviews, the film won 6 Goya Awards, including Best Director. It also marked his first collaboration with producer Andrés Vicente Gómez and Jorge Goicoechea, a partnership that continues to this day. De la Iglesia frequently acknowledges the influence of international filmmakers, often citing Steven Spielberg, George Lucas and Ingmar Bergman, alongside Spanish genre filmmakers like Jesus Franco and Paul Naschy. That said, he is very quick to downplay the significance of influences, remarking that, quote, "To say you're a great director because you know the great masters is like saying you're great in bed just because you've seen a lot of porno films." End quote. Over the years, he has amassed numerous international awards and was elected president of Spain's Academy of Cinematographic Arts in 2009. The same year, he founded the production powerhouse Poughkeepsie Films with his partner, the actress and producer Carolina Bang. Poughkeepsie Films has since backed work by filmmakers such as Jaume Balaguero, Eduardo Casanova and Esteban Royal. They also produced the hit HBO series 30 Coins, and more recently launched the Fear Collection, a partnership with Sony Pictures and Amazon Prime to develop a series of horror films directed by Spanish filmmakers. This then brings us to El Bar, which was the first of De la Iglesia's films that he also produced. While I'm not going to go into too many of the plot details, I will be discussing some of them as well as the central themes, and these do reveal quite a bit. So, if you'd rather go in cold, now's the time to hit pause. De la Iglesia has described El Bar as a comedy of terrors, and the premise is deceptively simple. A seemingly random group of strangers, all from different backgrounds, find themselves trapped inside a bar in Madrid after a sudden and unexplained incident outside. With no clear answers, paranoia sets in, and the group rapidly turn on each other. Watching the film today in a post-COVID world, it's almost impossible not to filter it through the lens of lockdowns, the panic buying, the hysteria, the wild conspiracy theories, and the sheer unpredictability of human behaviour during a crisis. On my first watch, back in 2017, I remember thinking at the time that the character's descent into chaos felt ridiculous. For me at the time, it was exaggerated, too quick and too extreme. But watching it now in hindsight, the film feels eerily prophetic. That said, of course El Bar wasn't inspired by a virus that wouldn't appear for another 3 years. Instead, De la Iglesia drew from his own cynical view on human nature, as well as the escalating wave of terrorist violence that has marked the 21st century. He also drew, most notably, from Louis Buñuel's The Exterminating Angel from 1962. In Buñuel's film, a group of fairly grotesque bourgeois socialites find themselves inexplicably trapped in a room after a dinner party, slowly shedding their civility to reveal their primal selves. Many critics have seen this film as a critique of Franco-era Spain and the ruling elite, a suggestion that the upper classes harbour savage instincts and unspeakable secrets. It's very interesting to talk about Buñuel here in the context of this movie and the context of De la Iglesia, as it's not just the similarity in concepts that link El Bar and The Exterminating Angel. In a BBC documentary about Buñuel, his collaborator and scriptwriter Jean-Claude Carrière makes a very interesting observation. He points out that, quote, "When we talk about Buñuel, we always use the word surrealist or surrealism, as though his work belongs to a niche, marginal way of making films. But in Spain, it's the opposite. No Spaniard would call Buñuel surrealistic, he's just Spanish. What seems strange, cruel, rare, or downright weird to outsiders is, in Spain, simply a reflection of a long-standing cultural tradition." End quote. This tradition we can trace back to the term esperpento, which is a dramatic literary style established in the 1920s. And this tradition applies not just to Buñuel, but to a whole lineage of Spanish directors: Juan Antonio Bardem, Pedro Almodóvar, Jaume Balaguero, and of course de la Iglesia himself. You can also see this tradition in full force in La Cabina as well. The words strange, cruel, rare and weird sum that film up perfectly. Esperpento essentially distorts reality to criticise society. It exaggerates the grotesque and absurd qualities of real life. It thrives on contrast, surreal settings and nightmarish elements, often blending the horrific with the ridiculous. Sound familiar? The key question that Esperpento asks is whether it presents a deformed image of reality, or whether what it presents is an accurate image of a reality that is already deformed. And that brings us back to the comedy of terrors that is El Bar. De la Iglesia takes the concept of Buñuel's exterminating angel and pushes it even further. He suggests it's not just the elite who harbour dark secrets. All humans, regardless of class or background, have a darkness inside them. It doesn't take much for the mask of civility to slip, and in El Bar, it slips within the first few minutes. In interviews at the time of the film's release, the director shared a disturbing news story that helped inspire the film. He spoke of a group of smiling beachgoers taking selfies with a stranded dolphin, and in their eagerness to pose with it, they ended up killing it. For him, this incident perfectly encapsulates humans' inability to see the bigger picture. We are so focused on our immediate concerns and interests that we don't realise when we're causing disaster. El Bar picks up this idea and runs with it. Each character is trapped inside their own selfish panic, incapable of thinking beyond their own survival, which leads them from one crisis to another. This bleak outlook on human behaviour is deeply personal. I've spoken of his childhood and the impact of ETA terrorism, and in interviews he's recounted two key moments from this childhood during the height of this period which seem to have shaped his worldview. The first, he was getting off a bus when gunfire erupted nearby. He and his friends instinctively ran, not to safety, but straight into a sweet shop. The adults were too distracted to notice them, so they took full advantage, stuffing their bags with candy and picking up bloodied sweets from a floor that were lying amongst spent bullet casings. Then they walked to school and never spoke about it again. The second story, he was in mid-conversation with a friend when gunfire broke out. A burly man, who, in hindsight was probably military, tackled his friend to the ground and sent him flying. Then, as if nothing had happened, the man picked himself up, brushed himself off, shot them both a "what the hell are you looking at" glare, and walked away. Again, neither he or his friend ever discussed it. Having grown up surrounded by violence, he has acknowledged that global terrorism in the 21st century was a significant influence on the film. He was already working on the script when terrorists attacked Paris in November 2015. Though the attack didn't alter the script, it confirmed his belief that we live in an age of mounting fear and anxiety. For him, El Bar reflects and represents that growing sense of entrapment, that wherever you look, there is no way out and no escape. Distrust is part of the film's lifeblood, impacting every character and interaction. From the very start, the television set blares a reality show where contestants warn the viewers to trust nobody, setting the tone for the paranoia that is to follow. When the first shots are fired outside the bar, the news offers no real answers, giving conflicting reports and evasive half-truth before lying outright on behalf of the government. As the survivors turn on each other, alliances shift, every confession is a calculated move, and even the smallest gestures become suspect. The authorities are unseen, the outside world remains a mystery, and inside the bar, every character operates under the assumption that everyone else is a liar, a threat, or something even worse. While the film might initially seem like a warning to trust no one, the paranoia is quickly undercut by something far deeper. As the story progresses, the characters and the audience are forced to examine themselves. Who we like to think we are is very different from who we become when survival is at stake. As in much of Della Iglesia's work, the film is ripe with religious symbolism, which reinforces the film's central themes of judgment, guilt, and survival. The homeless man, Israel, whose very name evokes biblical weight, spouts passages from the Book of Revelation, which eerily align with the group's descent into chaos. What follows the initial shock and paranoid infighting and betrayals are a series of confessions, prompted by the realization that what we desire materially will provide no comfort in the ultimate day of judgment. This is underlined by what I can only describe as a series of divine trials, by fire, by combat, and by water, in the filthy sewers that they have to wade through in order to survive. Even scattered coins from the fruit machine, first used as a breadcrumb trail in the sewers, end up being placed over the eyes of the dead, which feels very much like a nod to ancient superstition. This all sounds very heavy, but of course this is an Álex de la Iglesia film, which means it's also absurd, hilarious, grotesque, and chaotic, but in the best way possible. He has spoken at length about the unbreakable link between horror and comedy, arguing that the key is to laugh at what you cannot laugh at. The film is manic at times, the characters ridiculous, their actions completely farcical, but within the madness, there's also a sense of tragic inevitability. While El Bar might not be a horror film in the traditional sense, it plays on modern fears in a way that's truly nightmarish. Much like La Cabina, it straddles the line between existential terror and absurdist comedy, tipping into physical farce at times. De la Iglesia has said he believes people to be obscene, perverse, and provocative, and that while Hollywood cinema focuses on pure entertainment, he aims to be more transgressive. What interests him in this film is how people react when under extreme pressure, much like someone laughing at a funeral because they're overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. In El Bar, reality is distorted to the point where it becomes cartoonish. And yet, when we reflect on our own recent history, whether it's people stockpiling toilet paper or fighting over YouTuber branded soft drinks, perhaps the ridiculous is far closer to who we are than we'd like to admit. Though made over 4 decades apart, La Cabina and El Bar feel like two sides of the same existential nightmare. Both films take an ordinary everyday setting, a humble telephone booth, an unremarkable bar, and transform them into sites of inescapable horror. Both trap their protagonists in situations that defy logic, and where the true threat isn't just an external force, but the breakdown of order, reason, and ultimately, humanity itself. La Cabina leans into the surreal, with a silent, almost Kafkaesque inevitability, and El Bar is chaotic, loud, and darkly comic. But at their core, they are both stories about fear, isolation, and the grotesque absurdity of human behaviour under pressure. Both films embody the tradition of Esperpento, presenting distorted realities that reflect something far too real. And in true Spanish fashion, they remind us that horror and dark comedy are never far apart. So, that's it for my first horror double bill. If you're still with me, thank you so much for listening. But before we go, a few things. If you enjoyed this, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps. And if you know anyone who loves horror, please consider sharing this with them. I'd also love to hear from you. If you have memories of the BBC Two horror double bills, or the first time you saw La Cabina, or indeed on anything that we've discussed, please drop me an email at thehorrordouble@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Instagram at thehorrordouble for updates, extra horror chat, and more. Huge thanks to my friend Justin Parker for our original artwork. Please give him a follow on Instagram at jpkr_illustration. And finally, next Sunday, I'll be back to discuss our next double bill. We're going to be watching The Leopard Man from 1943 and Four Flies on Grey Velvet from 1971. One is a brooding Val Lewton classic, and the second is a feverish giallo movie from Dario Argento, filmed with paranoia, surreal visions, and more than a touch of the bizarre. So if you want to watch ahead, as of the time of recording, The Leopard Man is available on YouTube, and Four Flies on Grey Velvet is available on multiple streaming platforms, including Amazon Prime, Shudder, and the Arrow Player. Please do try to seek them out, and I'll see you next week for a discussion, just like at choir practice. Thank you so much for listening, and have a really good week. Goodbye.